Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Emma, I'm one of the librarians at Rockland Public Library. We are so thrilled to be hosting tonight's event with the Rockland Historical Society. Before we get started, a couple quick housekeeping things for those of us joining on Zoom, which I believe is that camera. Please keep your cameras and microphones off for the duration of the program. If you have any questions or comments, you can type them into the chat and we'll address them at the end during the Q&A period. And then for those of us joining in person, I have this little handheld mic here so that the people on Zoom can hear your question as well when we get to that period as well. The next couple events coming up at the library. Next Tuesday, the 20th at 6 o'clock, right after Juneteenth, we're going to be hosting New Shades of Blue out on the lawn for our first lawn concert of the season. We are very stoked about that. They're going to be so much fun. That's at 6 o'clock on Tuesday. And then the week after, or no, not the week after that, that Thursday, the 22nd at 6 o'clock, we're going to be hosting the group Mid-Coast Women for a discussion on the opioid crisis called What's a Mother to Do? And that should be a really insightful talk as well. I think that's it from me, so I'm happy to turn it over to the Rockland Historical Society's Brian Harden, who's going to be introducing tonight's speaker. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Are these? No, those are yours. Tonight we have a program that's a favorite topic of mine. It's Maine lighthouses, and I've been studying them for years because we have more than most places of our size, especially. We have 66 lighthouses, and each one of them is so different. And Rockland Breakwater is one of the most interesting of all because it is a gambrel roof cottage almost a mile out from shore with the light attached to the end of it. And when the Coast Guard was getting ready to tear it down and put a little tripod on the end of the breakwater, the city took ownership. So we have that lighthouse, and then we have Owl's Head on the other side. So, and tonight's speaker, Bob Trapani, lives in the keeper's house at Owl's Head Light. He studies, he is a technician for lighthouses. He's Coast Guard Auxiliary. He works with the American Lighthouse Foundation, which has chapters around the country. He's very enmeshed in lighthouses, but he's also probably one of the most knowledgeable people anywhere now. When he was younger, he probably wasn't. And I worked with Ken Black, but Ken Black told everything that he knew to Bob. So Bob is now the expert. And he's written about Maine lighthouses, and he started to do some poetry and prose that goes with them. And I have a couple of the books. The visuals are fantastic, and what he's writing is really interesting and really evocative. I'm proud of him because I've known him for 35 years, and he's done a wonderful job with these books. A couple of them at least will be available in the society after this. And if anyone else wants them, you can contact him at the keeper's house at Owl's Head, and he'll make them available. One more thing. The Lobster Festival is coming up, and we're starting to do our sheets for who's going to volunteer at the Heritage Tent, where we do local heritage and festival heritage. And Larry Goldman, who is hiding in the back row with the blue shirt and the blue hat. If anybody can volunteer anytime during those 5 days, speak to Larry afterwards in the society room, and he will sign you up so fast you won't know what hit you. So, thank you, and welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Brian. And thanks for everybody for showing up tonight. Rockland Breakwater, Brian, I'd like to tell people that it's the only place that I think you can go a mile out at sea without leaving land. it's kind of a unique circumstance, so that's really cool. But yes, thank you for the nice introduction, and again, thanks to the Rockland Historical Society, and Em, thank you. So Gleams and Whispers, Brian did briefly mention about the book, and I've got a lot to show you, a lot of visual elements that'll take into effect before I get to the end, where I actually will read about 12 or so of excerpts from the book. I wanted to let you know how we actually got there to developing something like this. So, of course, it all starts with your family. So we work out of Owl's Head Light. I'm there so much I feel like I live there. But I couldn't do that without my family. And a lot of the experiences, whether it be working with the American Lighthouse Foundation or the Coast Guard, that's really cool stuff, but we do a lot as a family as well, which allows you another unique experience to experience the lighthouses. But I have served 25 years in maritime preservation and been the director for the American Lighthouse Foundation these last 18 years. And I have 23 years experience as a lighthouse technician working as a Coast Guard auxiliary for the Coast Guard. I am attached to the U.S. Coast Guard Aids and Navigation Team Southwest Harbor. They have 26 lighthouses that go from Marshall Point at Port Clyde to the Canadian border. So if you ask a dozen people what lighthouses mean to them, you're more than likely going to get 12 different answers. It'll vary. And I think that's some of the charm about lighthouses, is that whether it's their history, whether it's the romance, the mystery, whether it's your family, you've got a wedding there, you vacation there, there's all kinds of reasons to love lighthouses. But one of the things in developing this type of book, or just the knowledge in general, is you can visit a lighthouse over and over, and oftentimes I even find myself, I have to tell myself, look for something new, because when you become familiar with something, you think, oh, I've been there, I've seen that, what can I see? Well, there's always something to see. And it may be the marine traffic that's a little bit different. It may be the light. It may be the weather. There's all kinds of things. And then also, just being able to absorb the entire site, because a lot of times we get fixated on the lighthouses themselves, but they're part of a beautiful environment. So I seek to let times of reflection flow, enable what's heartfelt to manifest, and capture a smattering of thoughts that inspire. Maybe it crystallizes when I'm out there, maybe it doesn't. It doesn't matter. I believe in staying curious and staying adventurous in all things of the mind and heart, so I wonder, think, and write. So I use this picture, the shadow of Portland Head Light. Within it, nothing is found, and yet everything is revealed depending on your perspective. And what I mean by that is when you understand their history, the men and women and children who kept these structures, there's so much. When you can look at that shadow, all of time is in a sense encapsulated in that. So there's also times when I'm not sure what I'm hoping to find along the lighthouse path. Their gilded past is adrift, and the present whispers promises that surely must fall short of the heart's yearnings. Yet the quenchless query beckons, and so to the lights I journey. Because there's oftentimes you want to try to capture your feelings and why do these structures mean so much? And oftentimes you're not able to actually touch that, but you still go back. But the foundation for it starts with history. And this picture was taken at Isle of Ho, Light. When I try to write, I try to actually, without the reader even knowing it, get some sort of understanding of lighthouse history. It may not be a person by name, but it may be what they did, their duties. It may be some sort of thoughts. So history plays a big part in what I'm doing with this. I look at, quote, doors into history at every opportunity, and when they open, in the mind, I walk through. So what we're looking at here is Fort Point through on the what would be your left, and Petite Manan Light on the right. And speaking of history, oftentimes when I'm out doing this in all kinds of weather, all four seasons, I think about the people. Like I said, the men, women, and children who kept these lights. These were keepers at Petite Manan. You've got Keeper William Williams and his wife, Mary Abby Williams, at Boone Island. Clarence and Annette Schofield at Squirrel Point. I mean, there's thousands. I just picked out a couple for you. Ida and Harry Dobbins at Bear Island Light Station. Archford and Bertha Haskins at Owl's Head Light. Amanda and Eugene Coleman at Bass Harbor Headlight. And of course, needless to say, pets. Pets played a role in all of lighthouse history. Coast Guard, also, I mean, oftentimes the Coast Guard lightkeeping era is overlooked. It wasn't as romantic. It was more of a military position, stations. But a lot of Coast Guardsmen who kept the lights were very proud of what they did. And of course, even something like the Flying Santa, you know, Captain Winkapaw, it's all part of why we love lighthouses. I love this picture. I mean, if anybody's read the book Fillmore Wass had written some years back, Lighthouse in My Life, or I think I got that title right, but this was his mother and father, Hervey and Mabel Wass, and of course the children there, with Fillmore being the smallest. Just being offshore at an island like that with a family, and these children today, if we see what they did back then, we'd probably not believe they let children do all that in Rome and go to different parts of the island, get in their boat and go. But it was a different time and a different place, but it's amazing to think about. And of course, pets. You know, we have Spot, the lighthouse dog, at Owl's Head, but Keeper Thomas Orchid with his dog Sailor. So many of the keepers taught their dogs to pull on that rope and ring the fog bell, and they loved it when the steamboats or whatever would, you know, hoot back at him. So he's a famous dog for doing that. Of course, you can't talk about lighthouse history without mentioning Augustin Fresnel. For those who don't know, he was a French physicist who in 1822 actually created what we call the Fresnel lens and the technology for it. And we've never been able to actually improve upon it. In fact, a lot of our acrylic lenses today, prior to the advent of the LED, use the same technology that Fresnel created back in 1822. But when I think of Fresnel, when I'm in these lighthouses, like the one on the left, the picture there is the spectrum of light in West Quoddy Head that's on the watchroom below. This one on the right is from the Fresnel lens at Owl's Head. And I often wondered, as he was doing his experiments, of course there was a lot of science and mathematics, but he had to play with the glass and he had to see what the light did. And I wonder how that fascinated him. So sometimes I'll think about something like that. And of course, Abby Burgess. It's just being able to go out to and service the light at Matinicus Rock over the years. And every time I'm out there, she always comes to mind. And every so often, the crew that I'll work with, we will stop by the gravesite and, you know, basically pay the respects and remember the history. We also like to introduce new people at the unit to something like that so that they understand when they're keeping the lights today that there's a rich history attached to them. And then I look for stuff that still remains. Like this inscription here is inside, it's in the Whistle House at Cape Elizabeth. It's kind of almost gotten patched over a little bit, but I find things like that that kind of harken back to a different time very interesting. Here's a sign inside of the entryway inside Dice Headlight in Castine, which is really cool that that sign is still there after all these years. That lighthouse was decommissioned in 1934 prior to eventually coming back online in 2008. You don't usually see lighthouses come back online once they've been taken off, but a microburst back in 2007 had taken down the steel skeleton tower, and the town of Castine asked the Coast Guard, well, why can't we put a light back in the lighthouse? And the Coast Guard agreed, so that's a neat story. And of course, looking for history, this is the base of Doubling Point Light when it was first built in 1898. And you can see it was moved, well, it was 520 feet. It was moved, I guess in that direction, be almost like a westward direction. For whatever reason, when the engineers established this light, they chose that spot, but for ships coming down from Bath, they could not see it around the point. So they eventually decided after a year and a half that they had to relocate the light and place it where it is today. So a base like this, though, it does remind you of even something like a, quote, mistake that still remains. And of course, equipment. You can come to some of the offshore lights and you'll see some of the old steam boilers for the fog signals and things like that still out there. They were too big to move off these islands. And the Lighthouse Service or the Coast Guard would just leave those, and they're relics, they rust, but they're hearkening back to a different time. And of course, anybody who's been to Portland Headlight knows about the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow plaque there. I never not go there and not at least stop and take a brief look at it. And especially with trying to think about lighthouses, I mean, obviously he was one of the luminaries in regards to that era of poetry. So it's neat to think that he came to Portland Headlight, and you wonder how much he contemplated there and how much that played into his development of his own poetry. And of course, history today, Maine Lighthouse Museum. Always periodically like to stop by, and though, like Brian and Phelps and others here, you know what's inside that, I always love going there and just kind of taking a couple of different artifacts and really kind of looking at them a little bit more. And sometimes when you have experiences too, eventually you go back in there and you say, well, there's been a new experience that I can apply my appreciation to when you go through there. So I always tell people, it doesn't matter if you've seen something, you go back and see it again, and it'll be a rewarding experience. But the collection there is amazing, and just proud to have it here in Rockland. So a lot of people, when the keepers were removed, we often mistakenly think that history stopped when the keepers and their families were removed. History has not stopped. I chose this picture because the walkway at Goat Island, it just stops. And that's how I like to take some of my photographs, and how can I apply it when I'm trying to think about lighthouses in general. I said it may look different, but as long as the lights still stand and shine, new chapters are being written. Some people don't consider it as romantic today, but I even look at volunteers who work at our lighthouses and the contributions they're making. They're actually carrying out the same type of activity in one respect that the lighthouse keepers were expected to do. A lot of people don't realize lighthouse keepers, they had to open their towers during the daylight hours to visitors, and they would be expected to accompany, if they didn't have jobs, to do that, to accompany them up, and of course make sure they didn't touch the Fresnel lens or things of that nature. But even something like the volunteers at our lighthouses that are allowing the public to come in, I mean, that's just a part of what was history bygone. And of course, we're still making history. Of course, the Coast Guard is still keeping the lights shining, and even for those lighthouses that are now maybe decommissioned, we have some here in Maine that are decommissioned, but I think almost all of them are in great hands with the ones that have been decommissioned with private owners. Most of those owners, you can see they really care about protecting the history of what they own. So this is Matinicus Rock for those who are not familiar. Sense of place is another thing that I really like to focus on when I'm out just taking in a lighthouse. So on an island, there's a deep-rooted way of life. The ways are old, and its abundance is of a different kind. There's a freedom to relish and a hardiness sure to refine. There was also a lot of hardship and there could be tragedy, of course, on these islands, but it's amazing to see how people adapted. And maybe they didn't know any better in a different time. Today, we would look at that and say, that's not for us. Some people might say it's awesome, and I'd love to do it, or at least do it for a month. But to think about people staying out on these islands, it's no different than we have islands where you have year-round, of course, at Monhegan, or over on Vinyl Haven or North Haven. But a lot of the keepers were stuck out really by themselves in a lot of these areas. So that sense of place, and this is a picture from inside the keeper's house at Curtis Island. This was taken some years ago, but I just thought that it was the touch that at that time Connie and Dee Dee Conover had in their window there, and I just thought that was an awesome sense of place there. This with the shadow was taken atop of Moose Peak Light on Mistake Island. Ann and I were just talking about Mistake Island earlier before, and why was it named Mistake Island? I said it's a shame because it's such a beautiful island. But yeah, it's when you're on that island, you know that it's Mistake Island. It's blueberries. It's a really beautiful place. The lighthouse today is privately owned. This is Little River. I enjoy seeing if the shadows you can usually get a shadow, of course, when it's sunny weather, but it does it, in this case, fall onto the keeper's house, which I thought, how many times has a keeper been atop a lighthouse, seeing that very same scene? And of course, looking out at Little River from inside the keeper's house. And today, Little River is an overnight stay. It's one of the American Lighthouse Foundation's lights. So from June through the end of September, people can stay overnight out there. I don't even know, there might only be a couple dates left out there because it's very popular. But beautiful spot, 15-acre island. Another sense of place, you're looking at Egg Rock Light off of Bar Harbor and with Champlain Mountain behind it. Of course, it's a zoomed in element of Champlain, but that is kind of the depth there is just really amazing to think about. There's no other scene in Maine quite like that. So anytime I'm on that backside of Egg, I always enjoy just taking in that view. And of course, so many people are familiar with Pemaquid Point Light, and just, as Brian said, I mean, each of these lighthouses have their own charm and they're beautiful. But the settings, you know when you're at Pemaquid, there's just certain views that are just going to say, I can only get this type of view here. And this is just a fun one. I said lighthouses always guided mariners, but on occasion they give directions too. And this is at Seguin Island, which, by the way, is the only Maine lighthouse with a first order Fresnel lens. It's also Maine's highest light, not tallest, because Boone Island's the tallest, but highest in terms of, because Seguin Island is so tall, its light shines 186 feet above sea level. So it's just, it's breathtaking. So to see that lens still in and still active, that's a treat. So I've climbed over rockweed-covered ledges, stared in the face of northeast gales, and trudged through waist-high snow, searching for many facets of the elusive meaning attached to lighthouses. Along the way, I have obtained a deeper understanding in every new sight, sound, feel, and smell of the sentinels. And even the smell, it's funny because you can go into some of these lighthouses, some are worse than others, but some of the ones that are not open to the public, you can go in and there's just the humidity, maybe it's a little leftover diesel, whatever, but come on in, sir. It's, you can tell it's unique to lighthouses, and it's not just one. You can find that same smell at a number of lighthouses, so it's interesting. Of course, so we had history, we had sense of place. Weather plays another factor in how I look at the lighthouses, because you look at history, keepers were always their logs, their memories, so many of them centered around storms and the weather. So this was Arctic sea smoke, I believe this was 2014 or 15 view from Rockland Breakwater. But we think of lighthouses, and of course there's that metaphor, that light in a storm. It is true. So I chose this picture just because this was Rockland Breakwater, and just the way the rain played on the outside gave that wavy appearance to it, and that just struck me because it's not something you typically see. Of course, on the left you have Marshall Point, keeping with that light in the storm, and then the reflection of this fourth order Fresnel lens is from Pemaquid Point during a storm. And it is amazing at Pemaquid Point, being in the lantern a few times during storms, and how that surf, when it comes in, it vibrates the ledge, and then just shoots up, and the spray will just come across the lantern, and you just hear that. And it goes right into the parking lot. It is really amazing to see. Another light in the storm, this was atop Westquatty Headlight in Lubec. And those rocks that you see out there, both the inner and outer, Sail Rock and Little Sail Rock, they were very hazardous to mariners, which is why this lighthouse was built. And this is a picture, and this was a really bad thunderstorm moving in at Whitehead Light a few years ago. And it was just amazing to see the leading edge coming into the island like that. These next two were taken from Owl's Light over Penobscot Bay. Just watching as the storms move west to east and the cloud formations, it's amazing. I'm standing out there and I'm seeing that line of rain coming, and you play it to the very end, and it's like, okay, now you got to go. Here's another one from Mousehead. And even on some good days, you can have, this is whaleback light off of Kittery. It's whaleback, yeah, and this is one of Maine's wave-swept lights, and if you get a storm, it can be well offshore, but if it has a southerly swell, you can count on whaleback light, usually taking in some seas, depending on the swells themselves, but I've seen it in person where it exceeds the tower on certain waves, not every wave, but every so many will climb that structure. And this was just a unique perspective from Long Sands Beach in York, looking out at Nubble Light and just seeing the surf roll in. And just something about that was really, and then watching the wind take that surf and throw it backwards. Pemmican Point again during a snowstorm. One thing this was taken, I think it was just taken this past winter, and with the changes from the incandescent lamps to the LEDs inside the Fresnels, it has changed the hue. So you have that golden hue, and now you've got more of a almost like your headlight. So you see those blue-white headlights. It almost gives that off, but it's. I love it because it's like we know we're going that way to LED, but they were able to field test an LED that could actually keep the classical lens in place, and so that's a win. And these two, of course, Marshall Point and Owl's Head Light, it is amazing. I try to time these storms where you know the weather's coming in, and you know you can't be too far from home before if it's really going to be a big storm. So you time where you want to be. And you try to get out of there, but it's amazing to see. I wish you weren't so distracted. Like it's so distracted. You know the weather's like you're kind of like, I want to stay here, but I can't. So you spend 10, 15 minutes, and then you know you have to hightail it out. But just to see the weather, how it plays with these, it's just amazing. And then you think about the lighthouse keeper, having to. Well, in the case of both Marshall Point and Owl's Head for years, they both had covered walkways, so the keepers weren't exposed to that kind of weather. But some lighthouses did not. So you could just imagine having to go out in the blizzard. And it didn't matter. They'd have to have the bell going, or the horn later, and the light, despite the fact that there was no mariner going to see that light, but it had to be going. And they were expected to make sure that the snow was kept off the panes, and that just had to be a losing job for whatever direction that wind was coming. This one, taken at Rockland Breakwater during a storm, I took it low, obviously, on the breakwater, but that seaweed or whatever, just the way, it just looked so mysterious like that, and it kind of spoke about well, it was a crappy walkout that day. And it wasn't so bad going back, but when you, going out, but when you come back and you've got that northeast wind blowing in your face, and a lot of times the snow starts mixing with sleet, oh. Kennebec River Range lights, this one was taken at, and I enjoyed seeing how the water there, it is tidal, but how it was freezing, and how as the tide goes out, the ice just starts to form around the banks of the, well, in this case, the gut through there, but very quiet. I think that's one thing, if the wind's blowing, it's madness. But if the wind's not blowing, it's just a gentle snowfall. The silence, the quiet is amazing. The view on your left is Curtis Island Light. And the bell is in Sawyer Park in York. And looking at that, it just reminded me, okay, this was a northeast wind that day blowing in that direction. And that's how a lot of the lighthouses will look on the lanterns, depending. It could be a little wider, but you know which direction the wind's blowing by which panes of glass, or in this case, the bell, is taking on the brunt of that. And of course, Owl's Head Light. Just another shot of the surf. I had already said about how thunderous this is, and I don't care how many times you see that. It's riveting. It's mesmerizing. when you look at this, and every so many of those swells are just going to hit, and you're just waiting for that explosion. And of course, the vibration, and then the salt spray. And then, of course, after the storm. In this case, this was at Hendrick's Head. Somebody's boat was no longer. They lost that. That was not good, but I couldn't resist that shot. This one was taken at Squirrel Point, and I really wanted to try to focus in on, just putting a piece of the keeper's house there with the door, just because that grabbed me as I came down the path. Anybody's walked out there, it's like a quarter-mile walk or whatever from the parking lot. But when you come out over, and that's kind of the view you see, and that was just beautiful to see that day. And of course, Pembroke Point after the snow. And it's one of the things I like to do is when I try to really make it around, like I'll come around something like this. I don't try to spoil it for anybody who's going to follow or whatever. You try to let others be able to enjoy that view. So yeah, I go out on my way to try to, if some other photographers want to come and be able to capture that, I'm not walking all over it. I mean, Mother Nature will take care of it soon enough, but this was taken on the other side of the Sugarloaf, so looking over at Brown's Head one year after a big storm. And it was fascinating to see the Sugarloaves at that view and trying to frame the lighthouse between the, like the Camel's Hump there. And Bass Harbor Head. This was a beautiful view that day. I do remember that the snowdrifts in that spot literally were up to your waist in spots. It was pretty crazy. And that was lived in by Coast Guard personnel till about 2014. So it was housing for the Coast Guard. So now the National Park Service owns it. And I do believe they've had, at least last year, and I think this year, they have caretakers in the summer living there. I tell people, though, I wouldn't want to live there. Too many people. You can't even get in the parking lot. They're looking in your windows. They're coming in the gates they're not supposed to. It's like your privacy is like gone. This picture is taken, of course, at the, Brian, help me out, the park. Marie Reed Park, yes, thank you. And it is amazing to watch the snow come off the Samoset Golf Course, and literally like two waves, in a sense, coming together before tide and melt takes over. And it's just like the dividing line there. And that's, you don't usually see it quite like that, but that day it was just like, wow. You talk about a shot you're not going to see. And that snow, anybody who's walked over there after a snowfall, you usually got to hug the gate or the fence that the Samoset is, because you'll fall well above, snow drifts are well above your head. And you can't see where you're walking anyway, so you could be totally off the path. It's pretty amazing to see. And of course, with some of these, this is Marshall Point Light. There, you always deal with looking at some of the cool ice that forms after some of these storms, because not all of them are going to keep the snow. It depends on how that goes, of course, and the freeze. So the ice is always a fascinating one to see. And this at the Rockland Breakwater, this was that crazy winter we had in 2014-15, I think it was, where we had like 120 inches of snow in the mid-coast. And it seemed like every 3-4 days there was some sort of 12 to 24 inches of snow. And it was after a February blizzard that the breakwater froze over, and it stayed frozen over for, I think it was like 6 weeks. Of course, it started to melt, and you had to watch your footing after a while. But the funny thing was, it was not a slippery ice. Like when it's mixed with that salt, it wasn't really that slippery. But yeah, that was amazing to see, and I've not seen it like that since. And of course, the lighthouse after ice. Again, imagine you're living there, and you want your windows, or it's going to be a little bit of work before you open up something like that. And then in the Kennebec River, you get these ice cakes that move down. Sometimes you'll get the larger ones when they ice break in March and they start to run, but sometimes it doesn't even take that. Sometimes you'll have a heavy rain and it'll break up the ice jam or cause an ice jam, but it might also make that ice run. And you can see how I've read stories about how keepers who were at Squirrel Point nearby or Perkins Island, and they had to cross over to the other side, and how these ice flows would cause all kinds of havoc to their small skiff. Like you had to really watch out for these types of things. And what you've seen on the surface a lot of times was like, like like an iceberg, there's always a lot more underneath it. And then when they come ashore and then the tide strands them, that's a really cool thing. And then ice storms. This was that bad ice storm we had in December, I think it was December 23rd of 2013. And when, I know from Lincolnville on up, if people remember, the telephone poles or wires were over. So I'd gone up and I'd seen at that time Terry and Jerry Cole, they were living there for like 30 years. But I remember there, and Terry said they were planning on having Christmas at the light, and that did that. There was no power, and they were going to end up going to one of their daughters. But the light was out. It was just, it was interesting. The whole lantern was frozen over. This one, there's artistry too. This was taken at the Rockland Breakwater after one of the ice storms. And just seeing how the light, played with that ice. I often find those kinds of things fascinating. I'll look for little details like that because sometimes I just get bored with just the standard photos. So I like to play with angles and then just these odd types of things. And Arctic sea smoke. I mean, anybody who's a photographer, they love Arctic sea smoke. I do too. It's amazing. It's a war of attrition to how long you can stay out in that kind of weather, no matter how you're dressed, and then trying to mess with your camera equipment and what have you. But yeah, this is Owl's Head Light, and this was just from this past winter. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this kind of view from the Rockland Harbor, looking out and seeing that billowing sea smoke coming in. It's just very haunting, eerie. It's just amazing. This picture was at Westquatty Headlight. This was, this day didn't have the billowing sea smoke, but just to like to say that, it's like the sea is on fire, basically, when you look at something like that. Same deal here. This was Marshall Point this past winter here. And this is kind of a weird one because typically we all know our Arctic sea smoke, we're going to get it in the morning. But the temperature had been so cold that one day this winter, I don't remember which day, that you could go to Marshall Point and get it backlit like that, which was very odd, and that was really neat to see. Of course, back to Rockland Breakwater, because that's a go-to spot for me for the sea smoke. I love it there. It can always play in the harbor a little bit differently. It's like, just what I'd said earlier about you can see something over and over, and I don't think any one day of sea smoke is the same. The way the wind or the temperatures or whatever, the humidity, it's all going to look different. I enjoyed the way the shadows with the sun was playing through this. And this was yet another winter. I think this might have been 18, I don't remember, but just the sun there, that almost looks apocalyptic. It's like, it's like, Fog's another one. Of course, sitting out at Owl's Head Light a lot, you get to see the fog rolling in. This particular frame, I do remember distinctly because a lot of times the fog will move in and it moves in just kind of gray. I mean, sometimes it'll roll in too. But this particular day, it literally, you watch this actually act like a wave. And I've never seen it again. But this day, it just kept coming like this. And it was like, and it was really wild. And it eventually overtook everything. But it was an odd one. And then you look down the bay from Owl's Head, and oftentimes you'll see these walls like this. And of course, I'm zooming in on this one. So this was probably, I don't know, this was at least 10 miles off. But I'm fascinated by that. And I'm thinking, imagine years ago before GPS, imagine you're a schooner captain and you're coming through something like that. It's like, wow. And then even today, I'll watch when the pilot boat goes out. And I'm amazed because you'll watch it, they're heading right for something like this, and then they disappear. It's really interesting. So when nothing can be discerned by sight, everything must be seen through sound. So it's anybody who's been on the water and has had their own vessel or what have you, that you're listening. When it's foggy, you're listening. You're listening for those engines. You're listening for anything. And it's an interesting dynamic. This is a picture of Little River in Cutler in the fog. And again, if you were a lighthouse keeper, of course, you'd have to have that fog bell or foghorn going. But you think about back in the lighthouse service days before it was electrified and how they'd have the clockwork mechanism, and they'd wind that up and it would go 4 to 6 hours depending on how the lighthouse service had it set up. They had the technology to make that go longer, but it kept the keepers on their toes. And I think, it's so, but if you were in an area, Little River's one, I mean, there's a few lights are known for their fog. You can imagine how much they actually taught the kids how to be able to wind that up. So they were good to be able to help with that kind of thing. And just a couple more fog. On the left is Lubeck Channel Light, and on the right is Pond Island Light at the entrance to the Kennebec River. And this is Egg Rock, again off of Bar Harbor. And Moose Peak. This Moose Peak, Seguin, Petite Manane, historically, they always had a couple thousand hours, anywhere between, say, 1,800 and 2,400 hours of running their fog signal. Some of the foggiest places along the Maine coast for the lighthouses. I said I like unique perspectives, and I really do try to seek them out because, like I said, I do kind of get bored with some of the standard stuff. This is just unwanted water inside the lantern at Owl's Head Light, but I saw the Fresnel lens inside. I was like, okay, I got to have that shot. So, but that's kind of what makes it fun. And then one of these ice cakes at Doubling Point, and on this picture, the ice was actually, it was a thin ice and it was standing up. So I got down and laid down and kind of been able to take it through that way. Just a unique perspective for that. And perspective. The Queen Mary II, a few years ago now, I guess. But you look out and you see that, and you're like, that little lighthouse, It's like, years ago, I know in the 50s, there was, I know in Delaware Bay, there was a freighter that collided with one of the lighthouses, and thankfully it had just been decommissioned, or the staff was taken off. Because if it hadn't, they would have killed the keepers. But the freighter went into, it was elbow of cross ledge. And I'm thinking, yeah, those freighters won't even approach this size today. I mean, you look at that, it's like, wow. Another unique perspective was just getting real low here at Owl's Head and using some of the rocks in the foreground. And I like the way the periwinkles were on the rocks. And it's just, those are kind of things that you let your imagination run with. And lenses, Fresnel lenses. The one on the left is from West Quoddy Head. It's a third order. And of course, when you look at these things, they have all, depending, you can move it back, you can move forward. And every time, something's different about it, upside down, this. And it's really fascinating. It goes back to when Fresnel was creating these lenses, how many times he must have tried stuff like that. And then this one on the right, this is the part right here in the center. It's at the Maine Lighthouse Museum. And what I really liked about that one was it was almost like a time warp, if you can imagine that, and how history goes back, and just how much history has actually went through those prisms over the years, if you think about it in that way. So that's one of the reasons why that one appealed to me. Here's another perspective. So you have this ice cake on the shores at Squirrel Point, and it had this hole. So I was like, okay, I can't resist. I got to take the lighthouse through that. And of course, the Pemaquid, I mean, you can find literally probably hundreds of thousands of photos of reflections. I do try to look for some of the ones that aren't the most popular ones. And this one just appealed to me because of the grasses and just the way the rocks were. And something like at Owl's Head, this was taken at the oil house, with these icicles coming down. It was like, okay, it just kind of speaks a little bit more about winter. So how can, when you look at a photo or a scene, when you want to try to size it up, I know most photographers try to capture the essence of that. So that's basically what you're trying to do. This one, everybody we know, we got the tide at Rockland Breakwater, and I wasn't nearly as death-defying as this looks. It's just that I got low on this one, and I was out on a rock that kind of jutted out, and I was pretty much at the edge of where the dry breakwater was. But I loved the way the motion and how this was coming over the breakwater at that point. So it is fascinating to see. I mean, I know we're dealing with some climate issues and things of that nature. I also think the breakwater has settled some over time, especially the further you go out, because most of the time the tide is so a combination of climate change and a setting breakwater is giving us this kind of view more on these big tides. Another focus, of course, if you like lighthouses, has to be on light. Light is, but it's more than just what the light itself is as a navigational aid. There's just, and we'll get into some of those things about light, because I have some things included about that. I find being in a lantern at night when you can't see out, this was in West Quaddy Head, and so you get the reflections of that third order lens. Everything goes dark, you can't see, and then all of a sudden, poof, this amazing light, and it goes off, and it comes back on. I think it's 2 flashes every 15 seconds. And to be able to see that, it gives you how light actually takes center stage on a dark seascape in the evening. Because I know at Owl's Head, the light's on 24/7 still for right now. And it's like a lot of people say, well, why is the light on? Well, there's a reason why the Coast Guard just kept those 1,000-watt lamps on during the day if they didn't flash. But yeah, it's amazing. It's overpowering, actually. Detail's another one I like close up, and this was the fourth order at Owl's Head, just being able to kind of the beauty, and you think about not just the beauty, but the science and how, the light. Basically, what Fresnel was trying to do was you had your prisms at the top and your prisms at the bottom, and it was designed to capture that light, focus it into a center beam, and send as much light seaward as opposed to losing that if you didn't have those prisms top and bottom helping you in the center there. And then I was talking about how Fresnel's design was never improved upon. So, of course, on the left you have the Fresnel lens looking in. This is Owl's Head. And on the right is what they call VRB25. This is one of those acrylic lenses. This was in Moose Peak at the time. It's no longer there. But that acrylic lens is working off the same principle as the Fresnel lens. So I think that's really a cool piece of history that's been more contemporary. And then this is just looking down into a VRB25. And you get the idea of, again, those panels and how the light, and you can see how the pencil beams on the light are being focused in the center there and spread out. And again, it goes back to, this is Dice Head in Castine, and how at night, again, you're up there and poof, you can't see anything, and then your eyes are blinded as the light comes back on. And just our incandescent lamps are being phased out by LEDs. I just thought I'd share something like this. This is just one of the, what would be a 6-place lamp changer inside one of the lights. I think this was at Petite Manan. And the glow of this little lamp and how the lens magnifies that little lamp and sends that guiding light out 16 nautical miles. This is a LED that is now in Marshall Point light. And I know they're not near as romantic, but there's a fascination to them. And I think the other thing too is in a day and age where lighthouses are not needed as much, very secondary. Some people say they don't even need them. I like to believe we need them yet. But LEDs are allowing the Coast Guard to carry the lighthouses forward and keep them lit at a much more efficient, cost-effective way. So we do have to at least celebrate that element of it all. But what you see here on the left is the first order lens at Seguin, and you're looking up through the third order lens at West Quaddy. And it's so awesome to see these lenses in place because the LEDs are fascinating, but when you can see something like this, it's a wow factor for sure. And I think this was my last Fresnel lens. This was at Owl's Head during sunset. And then you imagine how many keepers, I say oftentimes, I wonder how many sunsets they actually got to enjoy because they probably didn't. Because most of them were expected to, as they say, light up at sundown. So you're busy. If you had the wick and the mantle or the mantles, you're getting that already Like, you're not really worried about taking in this beautiful sunset. I'm sure they did stop for a second and look, but, it's not like they were just sitting up there going like this, They were busy. They had to have that light punctually lit at sundown. So time's another one that I really like to think about. So time may be tracked by the calendar, measured by the clock, but it is motion that is the very essence of time to me. And so the passage entails sights set forward and ambitions onrushing into life's unfolding. And for me, I think the schooners, when I watch them from Mousehead and I watch them and they're slow going across, to me that I'm watching time. And even when they disappear from my view, it doesn't mean they're not there. And so I view time that way. So even though history has gone by, it doesn't mean that history is not there. This is the Everett Libby coming back from Matinicus Island, from Mousehead Light. And you've got the Stephen Tabor and the Victory Chimes. This was taken a couple years ago. Always awesome sights to be able to see those windjammers. I got two pictures of the Abbey Burgess, the cutter here, the buoy tender in Rockland. This one, it goes along with another time warp type of thing. And this was just what I like to call lantern pane magic. Depending on how you're looking at it, and as the cutter was coming by the lighthouse, at the right angle, you could catch the scene, and then reflecting Monroe Island from the other side it was really a cool scene. And this is kind of the same, but this was taken from Rockland a few years back, Rockland Breakwater, and how the sun was playing on the panes that afternoon. It was fascinating. So those little details, those little oddities I like to capture and take my time to look at. And then this is a fun one, and sometimes time just flies by. So they don't normally come that near the lighthouse, but they had been in Rockland, and they came by and the lighthouse, and I knew I could hear them, and I'm like, I hope they come closer to. Sure enough, they did, and it just made for a neat opportunity. Another thing with time for me, I think about spiral staircases. So the spiral staircase and the long shadows speak of time, at least to me, but so too do the echoing footsteps that reverberate inside a lighthouse when we climb those towers today. So, I know when I climb, or anybody climbs, you hear your feet, and you think about how the lonely keeper, one step, and how it would echo through the tower. And so you can kind of, to me, I see time inside the tower like that as well. And here, this one to me was past and present holding hands. If you consider looking into a window at a time. So I'm seeing the tower today, I'm looking into the window and I'm thinking about its past. This was West Quoddy Head, for those not familiar. And this one here at Whitehead, this was a window along the Whistle House. So the reflection in the windows present a sense of looking back in time. And of course, reflections in tide pools is altogether another kind of window for me into time. This was Bass Harbor Head. At low tide, you can, if you dare so, walk out over those rockweed-covered rocks. And I look for interesting things like this, just more or less for what figuratively or metaphorically it can speak to me about. And these are both from Portland Head. I was actually out, in this one here, I was actually out in front of the tower walking, which is interesting at low tide. And then Marshall Point on the left and Squirrel Point Light. Again, these reflections, I know it sounds a little odd, but I'll look at them and again, I think about the history of these lights and how it kind of, even when in this case along the Kennebec, there was times where, of course, the reflection wasn't even discernible really. So you'd wait for that. But in a way, that's kind of history. Some of it we can see, some of it we can't. And so I see that like that. There's a shimmering Indian Island off of Rockport. And sometimes just the way these reflections go and how the lighthouses upside down and straight, and this both Rockland and Spring Point Ledge. Fascinating to watch how the water plays with the reflections. And as I said earlier, when I'm at a lighthouse, I try to look up down and all around. So tide pools are often fascinating to me. You have the one on the left, I just love the color in this one at West Quoddy Head. And then on the right, you have the urchins and the periwinkles there in the foreground. And so there's so much, and it all plays a role with our lighthouses. So it's a part of it. It's a natural environment. Of course, the lighthouse has its utility, but there's so much beauty around. And sometimes you have to stop looking up and just kind of look down and around. Of course, another thing that is really moving for me is isolation. And we talk about how these lighthouse keepers some of them were out in nowhere. And this is an aerial view. We were preparing to fly into Mount Desert Rock Light, which is about 20, some people say 26, but it's about 22 miles off of Bar Harbor. And it's this one and Matinicus Rock are Maine's most isolated. And if you go east, you go to Europe. But as we were coming in, you could see, Acadia behind, but what a distance. And I look at that as a divide. And you think about the keepers and their families being out of a place like this. In history, there was stories of keepers' wives wanting to bring soil out to this place and try to plant flowers, and how the sea would roll over this entire islet and wash away that soil eventually. So it had to be a bleak place after a while for families. I mean, even in the Coast Guard era, this was staffed, I believe, till 1977. It was not a popular place to be. I'm shooting this through one of the windows of the helo as we're coming into Libby Island. Again, if anybody's read the book by Fillmore Wass, this is where he grew up. And though the houses are no longer there, you have the Whistle House and the Lighthouse, of course. And just that island is just amazing. And to see them in the winter is such isolation. Of course, you can't talk about isolation without mentioning Boone Island. And I know I know I'm going to say this figuratively, but I mean, I know there was one year we were there through the tide cycle. So I got to see it at low tide and high tide. And at high tide, I'm totally exaggerating here, but it felt like you could reach out with both your hands and almost touch the water. It just felt like, and all I could think of was, wait a minute, the keepers, they talk about having to go to the tower during these big storms, and you could have 20 to 40 foot seas out there sweeping that islet. I can see why they went to the tower and hoped the tower stood. And it's just not a lot of real estate on these places. Here we are coming into land at Matinicus Rock, and this is the interesting one when on this east side here, and you get that story that Abby's talking about where those seas are coming up and flooding across the entire island. That east side is not shallow. I mean, there's a drop off there. It's like a 50-foot drop. So it's, when you see that, you're like, I cannot believe the seas are rolling up this thing, coming across. And I also read where anybody who knew Steve Hiller, his father Stan, was a keeper out of Matinicus Rock for about 10 years. And I remember Stan writing about how in the storm of 1950, where it really wreaked havoc there, they said that the sea spray was coming over the top of that tower there, which, I mean, they went to the old stone house for protection and hoped they stayed alive, because the houses that would have been located down towards the boathouse were getting flooded. So just to think about storms that powerful out there is just, wow. And then this is a view from Matinicus Rock in the winter where it's just like nothingness. And that's when you know you have pure isolation. There's hardly a sound, and you're just looking out. And again, imagine you lived in a place like this. It's like, it would be cool for like the first week, and then after that, it would be like. This is another one, Saddleback Ledge. This is another one for isolation that people don't give a lot of thought to. It's in what we call East Penobscot Bay near Isle of Ho. It's actually Vinyl Haven more. And out of the southeast, you would have the seas pile up on this place. The keepers here too often went to the tower to save their lives, thinking that everything was going to be swept off this small rock. So Maine's got its share of wave-swept lights. Here's Petite Manan in the winter. You know, in the summertime, this place is teeming with all kinds of seabirds, terns, puffins, razorbills, you name it. In the winter, it's like just plain silence. Halfway Rock in Casco Bay is another wave-swept light. So walking in the steps of the keepers and their families. I know for a fact a lot of Coast Guardsmen are really mindful of work aids to navigation, are mindful of our history. So we try, I like to work to capture some of these scenes where you put the old with the new. And so you have your group of keepers with what we will call the modern day keepers of the lights today. And out at Mount Desert Rock, you have 3 different eras of keeping a light. Performing some of the same tasks. The one on the left was actually at Halfway Rock Light. And then EM1 Max Ringstad here was in West Quaddy Headlight. This is really cool. They have on the left, on the St. Croix, the International Historic Site on St. Croix Island, there's this plaque on the stone that I remember seeing the keepers here. It was on the left, keepers Connie and Elson Small. And it was just neat to be able to say, they stood next to this rock. And, I don't know how many years were between it, but it's pretty cool. And of course, on the right, Coast Guardsmen at Hair and Neck in yesteryear. I think it was in the 60s on this one, and then in the last few years. And both of these pictures were taken at West Quaddy Headlight. I had EM1 Mike Giacalone and I had fun with this one because Connie and her friend, they had this picture taken on Lubec Channel's deck. I said, we're gonna reenact that one. So we did. And then, of course, on the right, you have Keeper Stroud and Keeper Hilt, and Coast Guardsmen now today keeping the light at Portland Head. And of course, beauty and majesty play a part in how I try to capture what I see in words. And don't we all love that? So you have Monhegan light on the left and Dice Head light and Castine on the right. Marshall Point light. And these are the days we all love to spend time out there and you can linger and it's just really cool. Brindle Point light on the left and Fort Point light in Stockton Springs on the right. West Quaddy Headlight. This was a neat day. I think you can see it. The grass was it was a strong southwest wind. And that was actually interesting to be able to even just a little bit capture that wind in a photograph. Obviously, it's hard to do that kind of thing, but what a gorgeous day that was. I wish we had those days right now. We're stuck in all these clouds. It's crazy. So it was not enough for me to simply admire the majestic beauty of the lighthouses. I was determined, and still am, of course, determined to peel back the many layers that exist within the far-reaching embodiment of these venerable sentinels through a blend of prose and photography. So oftentimes I actually will take a picture based on what I think about it and try to match them up if I can. So it's not, I don't usually take a picture and then write about it. I usually see something first with it and then try to capture that thought, if I can, in an image. And so that brings us to the book itself. Gleams and Whispers, Maine Lighthouses, and their Allure. So most of the images in this book were born out of what the scenes inspired in my heart and mind. Maybe it was a nod to history, the wow of the elements, nature's alluring glance, or splashes of romance, but whatever the reason, the views had to speak to me. When such times lifted the veil of grander contemplation, I endeavored to take my words and images and marry the moment in a lasting bond that could be shared with others. So here's actually, I think I have 12 of these. So this is one of the quotes from the book. Salt water and a drop of time stir flights of fancy, solidifying a lasting memory in the heart that is impervious to being unremembered. And this is Nubble Light. I think most people are familiar with this one, but the reflections are always a neat thing for photographers to capture, or regular people. But once in a while, it's just, you can get a good one and you start thinking about it. Light, it guides, it fascinates, and it brings hearts nearer. So for me looking out at this one was the American Eagle, and coming by Owl's Head Light, And I think that's why I love light about it. Of course it guides, but it does fascinate us, and it historically has brought people near. And I think today more figuratively, but I think it still holds true. This image was Boone Island. So imagination, when set free, will ascend to where eagles soar, to a lofty place occupied only by a guiding light that burns bright across the ever restless expanse. Come see, come listen, for the sea never changes, and memories in time, like a ship in a bottle, never really go away inside an old lighthouse. And Boone Island, I think I said it earlier, is Maine's tallest at 133 feet. Now, we don't have those ones like on the mid-Atlantic or down in the Carolinas where they're real tall, but usually we didn't need them because a lot of our lighthouses were established on some sort of headland. Being out on a boat one day, just watching sometimes the way the wake and the tide will play with water. So lighthouses have always been part real and part spiritual. Their physical attributes are readily seen and understood, but not so their symbolism and extraordinary essence. It is in their symbolism where lighthouses demonstrate their transcendence, eluding every undertaking by time and evolution to quell their relevance. So even though today we don't need these lighthouses for navigation quite as much as we did, they still speak to people like they always did. And that's important to try to capture that and keep that alive. This again is a shadow from the top of Lubeck Channel Light, and this is the quote from a book. Much history is concealed within the opaque shadows of the past. However, what cannot be seen is most assuredly felt. And if you love history, you can't get enough of it, I think you could understand a little bit about, what that might try to convey. This is looking up into the lens at West Quoddy Head. So light is utilitarian, light is symbolic, light is warm, light is dashing, light is aspiring, light is steadfast, light is prior, light is present, light is probing, light is convergence, light is hope, light is guidance, light is alive, light is you. Light, may it always shine. We have this image here from Goat Island. Throughout the transition of time, history does not cede its regal standing to advancement, for there is no betterment without the transformational constructs of continuity interwoven in our growth. Their very impetus and knowledge to attain greater heights exists because we have traversed the divides of time in notable fashion. It was longer. I've excerpted some of these, but to be able to fit them on a screen like that. This was Hendrick's Head. Lighthouses hold secrets close to vest that are only discernible upon the murmurs of the wind and the rhythmic flow of the tides. Yet this realm of intrigue and beauty is not simply confined to a stately presence on high. Rather, its revelations are actually gleaned from within the perfection of the breathtaking scenes that stretch far and wide. The regal lighthouse and all that it embodies accentuates this natural artistry in euphoric fashion. And I love the way the water, it's what I call thin water when whatever direction the tide's going, flooding or ebbing, but it'll often have more color, of course, because of the rocks underneath, and of course some of the sky and clouds too, and it can really be, in a sense, artistic in its own way. Looking at Matinicus Rock, why do lighthouses standing sentinel amidst a sea of isolation captivate our imagination? Might it be the intrigue that envelops these distant lights is found in their uncanny ability to stir the soul and conflict the mind? Is it loneliness or contentment? Is it forsaken or liberating? Is it misery or happiness? Only you can answer that. This frame from inside Owl's Head Light, its elegance and sparkle are classic. Its warmth, wisdom, and wonderment altogether enthralling. Even so, there is more to a Fresnel lens. Within its sphere ablaze, a pure sense of majesty abides. The glow is otherworldly, its domain wholly riveting. Such grand theater defies words of adequate expression, yet in silent stillness, the heart fathoms every subtlety, every radiant mystery. In some measure, therein resides the allure of the Fresnel lens. a reflection of Pembroke Point. Solitude never walks alone at the lights, for romance, mystery, and wonderment are always close by. And it's really true. I mean, if you take the time to seek those types of things out, you'll find them. And that's why I encourage people, like, a lot of times even at lighthouse events, they're like, hustle, hustle, hustle. And it's a shame because sometimes you want people to say, no, take your time, linger, and just absorb it, soak it up. This one at Whitehead Light, it says, one does not need to reside at a lighthouse to live at a lighthouse, for they are deep emotional places where many feel more alive than at any other abode ever encountered. So all I can do is just be true to myself, gather what the senses experience, wonder without boundaries, and remember. I must remember until I can't. Because it's like one of those things, as you get older, some of these things are going to slip your mind. So it's like, remember. In the end, I do realize that I'm searching for something I will never fully discover. Despite that, I'm continually urged on by the notion that doors into the past can be found in places where we least expect them. There is much in the way of joy on this journey of a lifetime. To me, joy is akin to light, a light not for the eyes, but rather the heart. So never stop wondering. And that's my presentation.
Excellent. Thanks. Excellent. Thanks so much, Bob. We are actually, unfortunately, out of time for questions, but I urge everyone to head down the hall to the Historical Society where they have copies of your book on sale and I believe some snacks as well. And you can ask any questions of Bob that you have down there.
Happy to do that.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bob.
You're welcome. Thank you.